The candle in Hazel Thornberry's hand trembled the moment she heard footsteps outside the linen room, and she pressed herself against the shelves, praying whoever it was would pass by without opening the door. It was well past midnight at Ashford Hall, and she had no good reason to be awake, mending a torn hem by candlelight, when she should have been asleep in the servants' quarters. But Mrs. Pemberley's gown had to be ready by morning, and Hazel had learned long ago that being useful was the only way to stay safe in a house that was not her own. The footsteps stopped. The door creaked open. "Still awake, I see." Hazel's heart dropped into her stomach. She knew that voice. She had spent 3 years trying to forget it, and in the space of one syllable, every effort had failed. The Duke of Rothmere stood in the doorway, tall and composed, dressed as though he had just come from a private study rather than wandering the halls of someone else's house at midnight. Corwin Vane had not changed much in 3 years, though something in his eyes seemed heavier now, more guarded. Hazel, on the other hand, had changed a great deal, and she knew it. Gone was the girl in bright muslin who had once laughed freely in a garden in Somerset. In her place stood a woman in grey wool, her hair pinned back without ornament, her hands roughened from work that no lady of her former station would ever have touched. She rose quickly and dropped a small, correct curtsy. "Your Grace, forgive me. I did not expect anyone to be about." "Nor did I," he said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, as though he were choosing each word with great effort. "I did not expect to find you here at all, Miss Thornberry." So he remembered her name. Of course he did. She had hoped, foolishly, that enough time had passed for her to become a stranger to him, one face among the hundreds he must have met since their last conversation. But the way he looked at her now told her otherwise. He had not forgotten. He had simply never expected to see her again, not like this, not in a servant's dress with a needle still pinched between her fingers. "I am companion to Mrs. Pemberley now," Hazel said, keeping her voice even. "She was kind enough to take me in after my father's affairs were settled." Settled was a gentle word for what had happened. Ruined would have been more honest. 2 years ago, her father's name had been dragged through every drawing room in London, his debts exposed, his reputation destroyed by accusations that Hazel still did not fully understand. What she did understand was that her family had lost everything in the space of a single season, and she had gone from a young woman with prospects to a young woman with none, grateful for any household willing to take her on. "I heard something of your family's troubles," Corwin said quietly. "I am sorry for it." "You need not be. It was none of your affair." The words came out sharper than she intended, and she saw something flicker across his face, though he did not argue with her. She wondered, briefly, if he knew more than he let on. But that was a foolish thought, born of exhaustion and the strange unsteadiness of standing in a dim room with him after all this time. She pushed it away. "I should return to my work," she said. "Mrs. Pemberley will need this gown by morning." "Of course." He did not move at first, and for a moment she thought he might say something more, something that would break the careful distance they had both been keeping since the moment he walked in. Instead, he only nodded once and stepped back into the corridor. "Good night, Miss Thornberry." "Good night, Your Grace." The door closed, and Hazel sank back onto her stool, her hands shaking so badly that she pricked her finger with the needle. She stared at the small bead of blood welling up and thought, with a kind of bitter clarity, that she had spent 2 years learning how to disappear, and it had taken him less than a minute to see her anyway. By the time the sun rose over Ashford Hall, Hazel had convinced herself that the encounter had been nothing more than an unfortunate accident, the kind of chance meeting that happens in a house full of guests and would not happen again. She dressed carefully in her plainest gown, a dull gray that she had chosen deliberately from the modest wardrobe Mrs. Pemberley provided her, and pinned her hair back so tightly that not a single curl dared to escape. It was armor, of a sort. If no one looked at her twice, no one would ask questions. And if no one asked questions, no one would discover exactly who she had once been, and what her family's disgrace might mean for a woman trying to survive in service to someone else. She found Mrs. Pemberley already awake in the breakfast room, fussing over a letter that had arrived with the morning post. "Hazel, dear, come look at this," the older woman said, waving the paper. "Lady Osgood has invited us to walk in the East Gardens this afternoon. Apparently her brother is staying at Ashford Hall as well, and she wishes to introduce him properly to the other guests." Hazel's stomach tightened. Her brother? "The Duke of Rothmere, yes. Have you heard of him? A very serious sort of man, I understand, though perfectly respectable. Lady Osgood says he rarely attends these gatherings, so it is quite an occasion that he has come at all." Mrs. Pemberley folded the letter with satisfaction, entirely unaware of the way Hazel's hands had gone still over her teacup. "We shall have to look our best." I am sure I shall be too busy with your correspondence to join the walk, Hazel said quickly. There are several letters that need answering, and your blue silk still wants mending at the shoulder. Mrs. Pemberley waved this away without much concern. Nonsense. The letters can wait an hour. You spend far too much time hidden away with your needle, Hazel. A little fresh air will do you good, and Lady Osgood specifically asked that you come along. She said she remembered you from somewhere, though for the life of me I cannot think where. Hazel's throat went dry. She did not remember ever meeting Lady Osgood. But if the woman was the Duke's sister, it was entirely possible their paths had crossed years ago, before everything had changed, before Hazel had learned to make herself small enough to escape notice. There was no polite way to refuse without raising suspicion, and Hazel had learned that suspicion was more dangerous than almost anything else. A companion who avoided every social event too consistently invited questions, and questions were the last thing she wanted. So she agreed, with a tight smile, and spent the rest of the morning dreading the walk with a feeling that sat like a stone in her chest. The East Gardens at Ashford Hall were beautiful in the way that only old, well-tended gardens could be, full of roses trained along stone walls and paths that wound beneath ancient trees. Hazel walked a careful half-step behind Mrs. Pemberley, her eyes fixed on the gravel path, determined to keep her attention anywhere but on the small group of guests gathered near the fountain ahead. She could hear Lady Osgood's voice before she saw her, bright and warm, greeting new arrivals with the easy confidence of a woman who had never once had to fight for her place in the world. Mrs. Pemberley, and you must be Miss Thornbury. Lady Osgood turned toward them with a smile that seemed genuinely delighted, and Hazel forced herself to curtsy properly. I knew it. I never forget a face, even after so many years. You attended my cousin's wedding, did you not? In Somerset? Hazel's mind raced back to a summer that felt like another life entirely. A garden much like this one, laughter and music, and a young man who had once found excuses to stand near her all afternoon. I believe I did, my lady. It has been some years. It has indeed, and look how well you've grown into yourself. Lady Osgood's eyes were sharp, missing nothing, and Hazel had the uncomfortable sense of being studied rather than simply greeted. My brother mentioned he had encountered an old acquaintance last night. I did not think to connect it to you until just now. So he had spoken of her. Hazel kept her expression carefully neutral, though her pulse quickened uncomfortably. Your brother is very kind to remember me at all, my lady. It has been a long time since our circumstances allowed for much acquaintance. Nonsense. Corwin remembers everyone he cares to remember, and forgets everyone he does not. Make of that what you will. Lady Osgood said it lightly, almost teasingly, but there was something searching in her gaze that made Hazel deeply uneasy. Before she could think of a proper reply, she felt a shift in the air around them, a subtle change in the way the other guests straightened and quieted, and she knew without turning that the Duke himself had joined the gathering. Corwin, Lady Osgood said, her smile widening with obvious mischief. You remember Miss Thornbury. There was a pause, brief but unmistakable, before Corwin answered. I do. Hazel forced herself to meet his gaze, if only for a moment, and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something careful and restrained, as though he were holding back a great deal more than two simple words. She dropped a small curtsy and looked away quickly, aware of Mrs. Pemberley beaming beside her, entirely oblivious to the tension threading through the conversation. How fortunate that we should all find ourselves here together, Lady Osgood said, watching her brother with an expression Hazel could not decipher. It seems Ashford Hall has a talent for reuniting old friends. Hazel said nothing. She was too busy trying to remember how to breathe normally, too aware of the Duke standing only a few feet away, too conscious of every eye that might, at any moment, begin to wonder why a Duke and a lady's companion seemed to share some private history neither of them was willing to explain. She had spent 2 years building a quiet, unremarkable life for herself, brick by careful brick, and in the space of a single morning, she felt the entire structure beginning to shake. As the group moved further into the garden, Hazel fell back deliberately, putting distance between herself and the others, though she could feel Corwin's attention on her even from several paces away. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself that whatever he remembered, whatever he felt, none of it changed her situation. She was a companion now, nothing more, and a Duke had no business remembering a woman who mended hems and answered letters for her keep. But when she chanced one more glance across the garden, she found him already looking at her, and the expression on his face was not the polite indifference of a stranger. It was something far more dangerous. It was recognition, and beneath it, something that looked painfully like longing. Hazel turned away quickly, her heart pounding, and reminded herself of everything she stood to lose if anyone discovered exactly how much history stood between the plain companion in gray and the Duke who could not seem to stop looking at her. 3 days passed before Hazel found herself alone with the Duke again, and in that time she had convinced herself the strange tension in the garden had been nothing more than her own overworked imagination. Guests came and went from Ashford Hall in the usual fashion, and Corwin Vane, for his part, seemed content to keep his distance, offering nothing more than a polite nod whenever their paths crossed in the hallways or at supper. Hazel told herself this was for the best. She had built a careful life out of being overlooked, and she intended to keep it that way, whatever memories a chance meeting had stirred up in either of them. Then, on a gray afternoon threatening rain, Mrs. Pemberley sent her to the library to fetch a book of sermons she had left behind after morning prayers, and Hazel walked the familiar corridors without a second thought, certain the room would be empty at that hour. She was wrong. Corwin stood at the tall windows, looking out at the darkening sky, a book open and forgotten in his hand. He turned at the sound of the door, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Forgive me," Hazel said quickly, already stepping back. "I did not know you were here. Mrs. Pemberley left a book behind. I only meant to collect it. You need not apologize for entering a library, Miss Thornbury." His voice was quiet, and there was something almost wry in it, though his eyes remained careful, watchful in the way they had been since that first night. "It is hardly a private room." Hazel hesitated in the doorway, torn between the urge to retrieve the book and flee, and some stubborn, foolish part of her that did not want to leave. She stepped further inside, scanning the shelves for Mrs. Pemberley's sermons, painfully aware of him watching her from across the room. "You have changed a great deal," Corwin said finally, breaking the silence. "In 3 years. People generally do. Not like this." He set his book down on a side table, and for the first time since their encounter in the linen room, he seemed to abandon the careful distance he had been keeping. "You used to wear yellow. I remember thinking it suited you, the way sunlight suits a garden. I have not seen you in a single bright color since you arrived at this house." Hazel's hands stilled on the shelf. She had not expected him to remember something so small, so specific, and the fact that he had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. "Bright colors are not practical for a companion's work, Your Grace. Gray does not show ink stains nearly so badly. That is not the only reason, I think." She turned to face him fully then, something sharp rising in her chest, half anger and half something far more vulnerable that she refused to name. "You presume to know my reasons." "I presume nothing. I only observe." His gaze did not waver from hers, and there was a gentleness in it that made her want to look away, and made her unable to do so at the same time. "You dress to be forgotten, Miss Thornbury. You keep your eyes on the ground and your voice low, and you make yourself as small as possible in every room you enter. I understand why. I do not think you understand how well it is working, and how much it costs you." Hazel's breath caught. No one had spoken to her so plainly in 2 years. No one had looked past the careful gray dresses and quiet manners to the woman trying desperately to survive underneath them. She hated that it was him, of all people, who had seen it. She hated more that some small, exhausted part of her was grateful. "My reasons are my own business," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness. "Whatever you remember of me, Your Grace, that girl no longer exists. My father's disgrace saw to that. I do not believe that." "You do not have to live with the consequences of it," Hazel said, and this time the words came out raw, unguarded, before she could stop them. "You do not know what it is to walk into a room and wonder if someone will recognize your family's name and turn you out before supper is served. You do not know what it is to depend entirely on the goodwill of a woman who could dismiss you tomorrow without a word of explanation, simply because it pleased her to do so. I do not have the luxury of being remembered, Your Grace. I have spent 2 years working very hard to be forgotten, and I would ask that you not undo it." The silence that followed was heavy, and for a moment Hazel feared she had gone too far, spoken too plainly to a man whose good opinion, whether she wished to admit it or not, still mattered enormously to her situation. But when Corwin spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier careful distance. "I am sorry," he said. "I did not mean to make your position more difficult. That is the last thing I would ever wish for you." Something in the way he said it, the quiet sincerity of it, made Hazel's carefully guarded composure waver dangerously. She turned back to the shelf before he could see it, pretending to search for the book she had already found some minutes ago. "I should return this to Mrs. Pemberley," she said. "She will wonder what has kept me." "Miss Thornbury." His voice stopped her at the door, and against every instinct telling her to keep walking, she paused. "For what it is worth, I have thought of you often, these past 3 years. I did not know what had become of your family until quite recently, and when I learned of it, I confess I searched for some word of you, though I found none. I am glad, whatever the circumstances, to know that you are well." Hazel did not trust herself to answer that. She only nodded once, quickly, and left the library with her heart pounding so violently she thought surely he must have heard it. That evening, Mrs. Pemberley's gown required a final fitting before a dinner planned for the following night, and Hazel knelt at her employer's feet with a mouthful of pins, grateful for a task that demanded enough attention to keep her mind from wandering back to the library. But Mrs. Pemberley, who noticed far more than she let on despite her scattered manner, was not so easily distracted. "You seem troubled, dear," she said, studying Hazel's reflection in the mirror. "Has something happened?" "Nothing at all, ma'am. I am only tired." Mrs. Pemberley did not sound entirely convinced, but she let the matter rest, for which Hazel was deeply grateful. It was only later, once the fitting was finished and Hazel had retreated to her small room for the evening, that she allowed herself to sit with everything Corwin had said, turning his words over and over, until she could not tell anymore whether they frightened her or comforted her more. She was still turning them over the following afternoon when Delphine Ashcombe arrived at Ashford Hall in a flurry of trunks and servants, and the entire household seemed to reorganize itself around her presence within the hour. Hazel had heard the name mentioned once or twice among the other guests, always with a certain careful respect that suggested Miss Ashcombe was a young woman of considerable fortune and even more considerable ambition, and it did not take long to see why. She arrived dressed in the height of fashion, every detail from her bonnet to her gloves chosen with obvious care, and she moved through the entrance hall as though she already owned it. "Lady Osgood tells me the Duke of Rothmere is in residence," Miss Ashcombe said to no one in particular, though her voice carried clearly enough for half the hall to hear. "How fortunate. I had feared this visit would prove entirely dull." Hazel, standing quietly near the staircase with an armful of Mrs. Pemberley's shawls, felt an odd chill settle over her at the words, though she could not have said exactly why. She watched Miss Ashcombe's sharp, assessing gaze sweep the hall, pausing briefly on every face, and when those eyes landed on Hazel for a fraction of a second, she felt unmistakably catalogued, weighed, and dismissed. It should not have troubled her. She was, after all, only a companion, entirely beneath the notice of a woman like Delphine Ashcombe. And yet something in that brief, assessing glance left Hazel with the uneasy sense that she had just been measured against a standard she had not known she was being held to, and found wanting in ways that had nothing at all to do with her plain gray dress. She did not have long to wonder why. That evening at supper, she watched Miss Ashcombe seat herself directly beside the Duke of Rothmere with an ease that suggested long practice at securing exactly the position she wanted, and she watched Corwin's expression grow carefully, deliberately neutral in a way Hazel had come to recognize all too well from their own conversations. He was polite, he was correct in every particular, and yet his eyes found Hazel's twice across the long table, brief and unmistakable, and both times Miss Ashcombe's gaze followed his, sharp and searching, landing on Hazel with an interest that made her wish, more than ever, that she had never learned to stop being invisible. By the end of the evening, Hazel understood with a sinking certainty that whatever careful peace she had built for herself at Ashford Hall was about to be tested in ways she was not at all prepared to face. Later that night, unable to sleep, Hazel slipped down to the kitchen garden for a breath of cool air, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders against the evening chill. The house behind her glowed with candlelight in a few remaining windows, but the garden itself was dark and quiet, and she welcomed the solitude after a supper spent feeling watched from every direction. She had not expected to find Colton Reyes there, seated on the low stone wall that bordered the herb beds, a lantern set beside him and a ledger open on his knee. As Rothmere's steward, Colton had accompanied the Duke on this visit to attend to matters of business, and Hazel had exchanged only a few brief, friendly words with him since his arrival, mostly concerning deliveries and household accounts that occasionally overlapped with her own duties for Mrs. Pemberley. "Miss Thornberry," he rose politely at her approach, closing the ledger. "Forgive me. I did not mean to intrude on your evening walk, nor I on your work," she said, managing a small smile, "though I confess I am surprised to find accounts being settled at such an hour." "His Grace's affairs do not always keep tidy office hours," Colton said, a hint of dry humor in his voice, "particularly not this week." Something in the way he said it made Hazel look at him more closely. Colton was an observant man, she had noticed, quieter than most in his position, with a steadiness about him that put people at ease. He gestured to the space beside him on the wall, and after a moment's hesitation, she sat. "You have known the Duke a long time," she said, choosing her words carefully. Since we were boys, in fact. My father served his father in much the same capacity I serve him now. Colton glanced sideways at her. I do not think I have ever seen him quite so distracted as he has been these past few days, if I may speak plainly. Hazel's chest tightened. I could not say what distracts him. No, Colton said, with a faint, knowing smile that was not unkind. I did not suppose you could. He let the matter drop there, to Hazel's considerable relief, and turned the conversation instead to safer subjects. The unusually cold spring, the state of the roads leading to the county town, the new arrival of Miss Ashcombe, and the flurry of activity her presence had caused below stairs. Hazel found herself grateful for his easy company, for the simple fact that he asked nothing of her and expected nothing beyond ordinary conversation. You seem a steady sort of man, Mr. Reyes, she said eventually, as the lantern light flickered low. I imagine that serves you well in your position. It serves me well enough, he agreed, though I confess, watching those around me tangle themselves in feelings they refuse to name has taught me rather more about steadiness than any ledger ever has. He said it lightly, almost teasingly, but there was something searching in his glance that made Hazel wonder just how much he had already guessed about the strange currents running beneath the surface of Ashford Hall that week. She did not ask. Some questions, she had learned, were safer left unspoken. They parted ways shortly after, Colton returning to his ledger, and Hazel making her way back inside. But as she climbed the narrow stairs to her room, she found herself unexpectedly comforted by the exchange, grateful for one honest, uncomplicated conversation in a week that had otherwise left her feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted without warning. She did not sleep easily that night. Long after the candle had burned down to nothing, she lay awake turning over the day's events, Corwin's quiet confession in the library, Delphine Ashcombe's assessing gaze across the supper table, Colton's gentle, knowing observations in the garden. Each thread seemed to pull at another, weaving a pattern she could not yet see clearly, but which left her with the unmistakable sense that the careful, quiet life she had built for herself at Ashford Hall was no longer entirely her own to control. The morning after Delphine Ashcombe's arrival, Hazel found a note pinned to the drying rack in the laundry room, written in an elegant, unfamiliar hand. It requested, in terms polite enough to be difficult to refuse, that Mrs. Pemberley's companion attend Miss Ashcombe in her rooms before breakfast to assist with the arrangement of her wardrobe for the coming week. Hazel read it twice, uneasy without quite knowing why, before folding it away and making her way upstairs as requested. Delphine's rooms were already in a state of organized chaos when Hazel arrived. Gowns spread across every surface, a lady's maid moving briskly between trunks while Delphine herself sat before the mirror, studying her own reflection with the critical eye of a woman accustomed to perfection. Ah, Miss Thornberry. Delphine did not turn around, addressing Hazel's reflection in the glass instead. I am told you have a talent with a needle. My blue silk wants taking in at the waist, and I find myself without a maid skilled enough for the finer work. Mrs. Pemberley assures me you will not mind the extra task. It was not a request, whatever its phrasing suggested, and Hazel understood well enough the position she occupied in a house full of guests far above her own reduced station. Of course, Miss Ashcombe, I would be glad to help. Good. Delphine finally turned, studying Hazel with the same assessing gaze she had used in the entrance hall the day before, only now there was nothing brief about it. She took her time, letting her eyes travel from Hazel's plain gray gown to her tightly pinned hair, and something in her expression suggested she was drawing conclusions Hazel did not much like the shape of. You are Mrs. Pemberley's companion, I understand. How long have you held the position? Nearly 2 years, Miss Ashcombe. And before that? Hazel's stomach tightened, though she kept her voice carefully even. Before that, I lived with my family, in Somerset. Somerset. Delphine repeated the word slowly, as though testing it for some hidden meaning. How curious. I understand the Duke of Rothmere's family holds land not far from there. Lady Osgood mentioned as much when she spoke of an old acquaintance renewed under this very roof. Her smile did not reach her eyes. It seems a very small world we live in, does it not, Miss Thornberry? Very small indeed, Hazel agreed, keeping her attention fixed on the blue silk gown now draped over her arm, refusing to give Delphine the satisfaction of a reaction. If you will show me where you would like the waist taken in, Miss Ashcombe, I will begin at once. Delphine allowed the subject to drop, for the moment, though Hazel did not mistake her silence for disinterest. She worked through the fitting with careful, practiced hands, grateful for a task that gave her somewhere to direct her attention besides the sharp, calculating eyes tracking her every movement. It was nearly an hour before she was permitted to leave. and by then her shoulders ached with a tension that had nothing at all to do with needlework. The encounter proved to be only the beginning. Over the following 2 days, Hazel found herself the subject of Delphine's attention in ways both subtle and unmistakable. A comment at breakfast about the modest fashions favored by companions, delivered with a smile that suggested it was meant kindly, and landed anywhere but. A pointed question at afternoon tea about Hazel's family history, asked in front of half a dozen guests, forcing Hazel to navigate a careful non-answer while every eye in the room turned toward her. A remark, overheard rather than addressed directly, about how strange it was that a duke should trouble himself to remember the name of his sister's companion's companion, when surely he met 100 such women every season. Hazel bore each small cruelty with the same practiced composure she had cultivated over 2 years of careful invisibility, but she felt the strain of it building, day by day, a slow tightening in her chest that would not ease no matter how quietly she moved through the house. Corwin, for his part, seemed to sense something of what was happening, though Hazel had said nothing to him directly. She caught him watching Delphine's interactions with her more than once, his jaw tight, his expression carefully controlled in the way she now recognized as his particular method of managing strong feeling. He did not intervene, not at first, and Hazel was grateful for it. Any open defense from the Duke would only confirm whatever suspicions Delphine was already nursing, and Hazel had no wish to become the center of gossip in a house full of people eager for exactly that kind of entertainment. It was on the 3rd afternoon, during a walk arranged for the assembled guests through the wooded paths beyond Ashford Hall's formal gardens, that matters finally came to a head. Hazel had positioned herself at the very back of the group, as she always did, content to admire the early spring blossoms in relative peace while the others moved ahead in pairs and small clusters. She did not notice Delphine falling back to walk beside her until it was too late to avoid the conversation entirely. "You walk very quietly, Miss Thornberry," Delphine said, matching her pace. "One might almost think you preferred not to be noticed at all. I find the flowers easier to appreciate without conversation, Miss Ashcombe." "How admirably simple your tastes must be." Delphine's tone remained light, pleasant even, though there was an edge beneath it that Hazel had learned to recognize over the past days. "Tell me, Miss Thornberry, does it not grow tiresome, being so very unremarkable? I imagine it must take a great deal of effort, to dress so plainly, to speak so little, to fade so completely into every room you enter. I confess I find myself wondering what you are hiding, that you should work so hard to be forgotten." Hazel's steps did not falter, though her heart pounded uncomfortably fast. "I am not hiding anything, Miss Ashcombe. I simply understand my position in this household, and I conduct myself accordingly." "Do you?" Delphine stopped walking entirely, forcing Hazel to stop as well, or continue on alone, and something in her expression had sharpened into open challenge. "Because I have watched His Grace these past 3 days, Miss Thornberry, and I do not think he shares your understanding of your position at all. I have watched him seek you out in rooms where you have no particular business being sought. I have watched him grow distracted the moment you enter a conversation, and recover himself only once you have left it. A woman in my position learns to notice such things quickly, and I confess I find myself very curious indeed about what history the two of you share, that a duke should look at his sister's companion's companion with such evident feeling." There it was, spoken plainly at last, the accusation Hazel had feared since the moment Delphine Ashcombe first swept into Ashford Hall. She kept her face as still as she could manage, though she felt the color drain from it. "I am afraid I could not say what His Grace does or does not notice, Miss Ashcombe. I have very little occasion to concern myself with it." "How very convenient that you should have no opinion at all on a matter so directly concerning yourself." Delphine's smile turned cold. "Let me speak plainly, since you seem determined not to. Whatever acquaintance you and the Duke once shared, whatever history lies between you, I would advise you to remember exactly what you are now, and exactly what you are not. You are a companion, Miss Thornberry, dependent entirely on the goodwill of others for your bread and your bed. I am the daughter of a very old and very wealthy family, and I intend to be Duchess of Rothmere before this year is finished. I would hate to see you place yourself in a position that cost you the little security you currently enjoy, over feelings that can come to nothing at all." The threat, though delivered in the same pleasant tone Delphine had used throughout the entire conversation, was unmistakable. Hazel felt something cold settle in her chest, a fear that went far deeper than wounded pride. Delphine Ashcombe had the connections, the fortune, and the social standing to make good on whatever quiet campaign of ruin she chose to wage, and Hazel had nothing at all to defend herself with beyond her own careful conduct. "I understand you perfectly, Miss Ashcombe," she said quietly. "You need not concern yourself further. I have no designs whatsoever on his Grace's attention, and I would be glad if the subject were never raised between us again. How sensible of you." Delphine's smile returned, bright and untroubled, as though the conversation had been nothing more than idle pleasantry. "I do hope we understand one another, Miss Thornberry. It would be such a shame for your position here to grow uncomfortable over a misunderstanding so easily avoided." She swept ahead to rejoin the main party, leaving Hazel standing alone on the woodland path, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, her mind racing through every possible consequence of the conversation that had just taken place. She had known in some vague and distant way that her renewed acquaintance with Corwin carried risk. She had not fully understood, until this moment, exactly how precarious her position truly was, nor how easily a woman like Delphine Ashcombe could unmake whatever fragile safety Hazel had managed to build for herself. She did not return to the house with the rest of the walking party. Instead, she took the longer path through the eastern woods, needing time alone to steady herself before facing Mrs. Pemberley, or worse, Corwin himself, with anything resembling composure. It was there, walking slowly beneath the budding branches, that she found herself unexpectedly interrupted by Lady Osgood, who had apparently taken the same path for reasons of her own. "Miss Thornberry," Lady Osgood's expression, usually so bright and teasing, had turned serious. "I saw Miss Ashcombe fall back to walk with you. I confess I do not think that conversation left you in very good spirits." Hazel hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal to a woman she barely knew, however kindly her manner. "It was nothing of any real consequence, my lady." "I do not think that is entirely true, though I will not press you on it if you do not wish to speak of it." Lady Osgood fell into step beside her, matching her pace with the same easy grace Hazel had noticed in her brother. "I will say only this, Miss Thornberry. I have known Delphine Ashcombe for several years, and I have watched her set her sights on my brother's title with a determination that has very little to do with any real affection for the man himself. I do not say this to alarm you further, but rather to assure you that whatever she has said or implied, it likely says a great deal more about her own ambitions than it does about any fault of yours." Hazel said nothing for a long moment, grateful for the kindness in Lady Osgood's voice even as she remained wary of revealing too much. "You are very generous, my lady, but I assure you, I have no ambitions in your brother's direction. I know exactly what I am, and what I am not." Lady Osgood's expression softened into something almost sad. "Do you know, Miss Thornberry, I think that is precisely the trouble. You have spent so long convincing yourself of what you are not, that I wonder if you have quite forgotten what you actually are." She did not elaborate further, and Hazel did not ask her to, though the words followed her the rest of the way back to the house, settling somewhere deep and uncomfortable that she was not yet ready to examine. That evening, alone in her room, Hazel finally allowed herself to consider, seriously and without the protective armor of denial, exactly what leaving Ashford Hall might mean. She had precious little money saved, no family to return to, and no other position secured. But the alternative, remaining under the same roof as a woman determined to see her ruined, and a man whose presence made every careful defense she had built feel suddenly, dangerously fragile, seemed no safer at all. She was still turning the question over, sleepless and uncertain, when a soft knock sounded at her door well past the hour any respectable visitor ought to call. She opened it cautiously to find one of the younger housemaids, breathless and apologetic, holding out a folded letter that had apparently gone astray in the day's post and only just been discovered, addressed not to Mrs. Pemberley, but to Hazel herself, in handwriting she did not recognize at all. She thanked the girl and closed the door, staring down at her own name written across the front of the letter with a growing sense of unease. She had received almost no correspondence in 2 years, certainly nothing from a hand unfamiliar to her. She turned the letter over in her hand several times before finding the courage to open it, half expecting some final piece of bad news, a debt long forgotten and only now called due, or word of some distant relation she barely remembered. The hand was neat and careful, the sort of writing that suggested a person of education taking great pains to be understood clearly. It was signed only with the initials EP, a name that meant nothing to Hazel at all, though the opening lines made clear that the writer knew a great deal about her. "I write to you now because my conscience will no longer permit my silence," the letter began. "I was, until recently, employed as a clerk in the office that handled the settlement of your father's affairs following the events of 2 years past. I have carried a heavy burden since that time, knowing certain particulars of the matter that were never brought fully to light, and I can no longer in good conscience allow them to remain buried." Hazel's hands had begun to shake in earnest by the time she reached the second paragraph, and she sank down onto the edge of her narrow bed, reading the words again to be certain she had understood them correctly. The letter went on to describe, in careful and measured language, certain irregularities in the accounts that had led to her father's ruin, discrepancies that the writer claimed had been deliberately obscured at the time, and a name, mentioned only once but unmistakably clear, connected to the family that now employed Mrs. Pemberley's protection and, more troublingly still, connected by blood to the very household in which Hazel now found herself residing. She read the letter a third time, searching for some alternative explanation, some way to understand the words that did not lead to the conclusion pressing in on her from every direction, but there was no mistaking it. According to the writer, her father's ruin had not been the simple, unfortunate consequence of his own poor decisions, as she had been led to believe for 2 long years. It had been engineered, deliberately and with considerable care, by someone connected closely to the very family whose son had spent the past several days looking at her, with an expression she had allowed herself, foolishly, to trust. Hazel sat very still for a long while after finishing the letter, the candle burning low beside her, her mind refusing to settle on any single thought long enough to make sense of it. She thought of Corwin's quiet apology in the library, his careful confession that he had thought of her often these past 3 years. She thought of his sister's warm, easy welcome, and Colton Reyes's steady, kind presence in the garden. She thought of every small kindness shown to her within these walls, and wondered, with a growing sense of dread, whether any of it had been genuine at all, or whether she had simply exchanged one careful trap for another, dressed up in gentler manners and softer words. She did not sleep that night. She sat instead by her small window, the letter clutched in her hand, watching the darkness slowly give way to gray morning light, and by the time the household began to stir around her, she had reached only one certain conclusion. Whatever answers this letter demanded, she could not simply set them aside and continue on as though nothing had changed. She would have to face Corwin directly, and ask him the question she had been too afraid to voice since the very night she first saw him standing in her doorway. She would have to ask him how much he had known, and how long he had known it, before he ever looked at her again with anything resembling tenderness. And Hazel found Corwin the following morning in the small study off the eastern hall, a room he seemed to favor for its quiet distance from the rest of the household's activity. She had rehearsed what she meant to say a dozen times over during the sleepless hours before dawn, and yet standing in the doorway, the letter folded tightly in her hand, every carefully prepared word deserted her at once. He looked up from his correspondence and rose immediately at the sight of her face. "Miss Thornberry, what has happened?" "I received a letter last night." Her voice shook despite her best efforts to steady it. "From a clerk who once worked in the office that settled my father's affairs. He claims the ruin of my family was not an accident, nor the simple consequence of my father's own poor judgment, as I have believed these 2 years. He claims it was arranged, deliberately, by someone connected to your family." Corwin's expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and finally a dawning, troubled comprehension that Hazel watched with her heart in her throat, searching desperately for any flicker of guilt that would confirm her worst fears. "My family? Hazel, I do not understand. What name does this letter give?" "Your father's man of business, a Mr. Halloway, who managed certain investments on your family's behalf before his retirement 3 years ago." She held the letter out to him, though her hand trembled badly enough that she nearly dropped it before he took it from her. "The writer claims Halloway manipulated the accounts my father had entrusted to him, diverting funds and falsifying records in a manner that made my father appear responsible for losses that were, in truth, none of his doing. He claims Halloway acted to protect certain interests belonging to your family, interests that would have suffered considerably had the truth of his own mismanagement come to light." Corwin read the letter twice through, his jaw tightening with each line, and when he finally looked up, Hazel searched his face for any sign of the guilt she had feared finding there. She found instead something that looked far more like genuine shock. "I knew Halloway, of course. He served my father for nearly 20 years before his retirement, and I confess I never had cause to question his conduct. But Hazel, I swear to you, I had no knowledge of any of this. If what this letter claims is true, then your father's ruin was engineered by a man in my family's employment, without my knowledge, and possibly without my father's knowledge as well. How am I to know that is the truth, and not simply what is easiest for you to say?" The words came out harder than she intended, born of 2 years of carefully guarded fear finally breaking loose. "You must understand, Your Grace. I have spent 2 years believing my father brought this ruin upon himself, that there was some failure in him I had simply never recognized. If instead it was arranged deliberately, by someone connected to you, then I do not know how to trust anything you have said to me since the moment you found me in that linen room." I understand your doubt, Corwin said quietly, and there was no defensiveness in his voice, only a steady, careful patience that somehow made Hazel's anger harder to sustain rather than easier. I would doubt me too, in your position, but I give you my word, Hazel. Whatever role Holloway played in this, I will uncover the full truth of it, and I will see your father's name properly cleared, if what this letter suggests proves accurate. You have my solemn promise on that. Promises are easily made, Your Grace. They are, he agreed, which is why I intend to prove mine with actions rather than words. I will write to my solicitor in London this very morning, and I will send Colton to make discreet inquiries regarding Holloway's current situation and conduct during his years of service. If there is any truth to be found in this matter, we will find it, and I will not rest until we do. Something in the steady resolve of his voice began, slowly and against her own considerable resistance, to ease the tight knot of fear in Hazel's chest. She wanted, desperately, to believe him. But 2 years of careful self-protection had taught her the danger of wanting something too badly, and she forced herself to hold back the full measure of trust he seemed to be asking of her. I will wait to see what your inquiries uncover, Your Grace, before I decide what to believe. That is fair, he said. More than fair, given everything you have suffered. He hesitated then, something more personal creeping into his careful composure. Hazel, whatever the truth of Holloway's involvement, I want you to know that my own feelings toward you have nothing at all to do with guilt, or obligation, or any desire to make amends for wrongs I did not know were committed. I have thought of you for 3 years because I could not stop thinking of you, long before I knew anything at all about your family's misfortune. Hazel's breath caught, and for a moment, the careful walls she had built around herself threatened to crumble entirely. But the memory of Delphine's cold warning in the woodland path returned to her sharply, along with the fresh, raw wound of learning that her family's ruin might be connected, however unknowingly, to the very household now offering her such tenderness. I cannot afford to consider your feelings just now, Your Grace. I have a great deal else to occupy my thoughts. She left the study before he could answer, before her own resolve could weaken further under the weight of his sincerity, and spent the remainder of the day in a state of restless distraction that Mrs. Pemberley, mercifully, attributed to nothing more than an ordinary headache. Colton Reyes departed for London 2 days later, carrying letters of inquiry that Corwin had spent the better part of a night composing, and the household settled into an uneasy waiting period that Hazel found almost unbearable in its tension. She threw herself into her duties with renewed determination, mending, writing letters, arranging Mrs. Pemberley's correspondence with meticulous care, anything to keep her hands and mind occupied against the constant, gnawing uncertainty of what Colton's inquiries might uncover. Delphine Ashcombe, apparently sensing some shift in the household's atmosphere even without understanding its precise cause, redoubled her efforts in the days that followed. She contrived reasons to seat herself beside Corwin at every meal, engaged him in lengthy conversations about mutual acquaintances and shared social obligations, and made a point of mentioning, within Hazel's hearing on more than one occasion, her own family's considerable influence and the advantageous match her marriage would represent for any gentleman fortunate enough to secure her hand. Hazel bore these performances with as much composure as she could manage, though she found herself, uncomfortably, unable to entirely dismiss the anxiety they stirred. Whatever Corwin's private feelings, Delphine represented everything a duke was expected to seek in a wife: fortune, connection, and unimpeachable social standing. Hazel possessed none of these things, and the letter now sitting locked away in her small writing desk only complicated matters further, tying her family's disgrace ever more closely to the very household she now depended upon. It was nearly a week before Colton returned, travel-worn and grim-faced, requesting an immediate private audience with the Duke that stretched on long enough to draw curious glances from the other guests at Ashford Hall. Hazel, informed by Lady Osgood that the two men had finally emerged from their meeting, made her way to the study with her heart pounding so violently, she thought surely everyone in the corridor must hear it. Corwin's expression, when she entered, told her everything before he spoke a single word. It was grave and careful and unmistakably confirming. "It is true," he said quietly. "Holloway manipulated my father's accounts for years before his retirement, covering considerable losses of his own making by diverting funds from several of my father's associates, your father among them. When your father grew suspicious and began asking questions that threatened to expose the scheme, Holloway ensured that the resulting investigation implicated your father instead, using falsified records that made it appear he alone was responsible for the losses in question. My father, I believe, never knew the full truth of it. Holloway retired shortly after your family's ruin was finalized, and the matter was never properly examined again." Hazel stood very still. absorbing the confirmation of everything the letter had claimed. Feeling something complicated and painful settle over her. Relief that her father's name might finally be cleared, warring with fresh grief, for 2 years spent believing him guilty of a failure that had never been his at all. "I am so deeply sorry, Hazel," Corwin said, and the raw sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. "This wrong was committed under my family's name, even without my knowledge or my father's, and I intend to see it corrected fully and publicly. Your father's name will be cleared, and Holloway's conduct exposed for what it truly was." "And what will that cost you?" Hazel asked quietly. "A public reckoning of this kind will not reflect kindly on your family, Your Grace, however innocent you and your father were of the actual scheme. It will cost whatever it costs," he said simply. "Your father lost everything because of a wrong committed under my family's name. I will not allow that injustice to stand simply because correcting it proves inconvenient." Hazel felt something shift inside her chest, some final piece of her careful armor giving way despite every effort to hold it in place. But before she could find the words to answer him properly, a sharp knock sounded at the study door, and Lady Osgood entered without waiting for a reply, her expression tight with an urgency that immediately silenced whatever Hazel had meant to say. "Corwin," she said, "Delphine is telling the entire drawing room that she has proof of an improper attachment between you and Miss Thornberry. I do not know where she obtained her information, but she means to make the matter public before this evening's supper is finished, and I fear there will be no containing it once she does." For a moment, no one in the small study spoke at all. Hazel felt the color drain from her face, every fear she had carried since Delphine's cold warning on the woodland path rushing back at once, sharper now for having been so precisely realized. "Proof," she repeated numbly. "What proof could she possibly have?" "I do not know," Lady Osgood said, "but she is speaking with a great deal of confidence, and half the room is already listening with considerable interest. Mrs. Pemberley has gone quite pale, Miss Thornberry, and I fear she does not yet understand what is being suggested." Corwin's expression had hardened into something Hazel had not seen from him before, a controlled, focused anger that seemed entirely unlike his usual careful restraint. "I will speak with her myself, before this goes any further. That is precisely what she wants," Lady Osgood said sharply. "If you go marching into that drawing room to defend Miss Thornberry, Corwin, you will only confirm every suspicion she is currently only implying. Think before you act. There must be a wiser course than simply walking into the trap she has clearly set for you." Hazel's mind raced, searching desperately for some path through the danger closing in around her from every direction. Her father's ruin, only just beginning to find its true explanation, now threatened to be overshadowed entirely by a fresh scandal of her own making, one that could see her dismissed from Mrs. Pemberley's service without reference, unemployable in any respectable household, her reputation destroyed as thoroughly as her father's had been. "Perhaps I should simply leave," she said quietly, "tonight, before supper. If I am gone, there is nothing left for Miss Ashcombe to prove." "Absolutely not." Corwin's voice was firm, immediate, leaving no room for argument. "I will not allow you to flee this house like a criminal, over accusations that have no more substance than Miss Ashcombe's own ambition. Whatever proof she claims to possess, I doubt very much it amounts to anything beyond speculation and gossip. We will face this together, and I will not let you bear the consequences of it alone." "You say that so easily," Hazel said, her voice catching, despite her best efforts. "But it is my reputation that will be destroyed, Your Grace, not yours. A duke may weather a scandal of this kind with nothing more than a raised eyebrow from society. A companion with no family and no fortune has nothing at all to protect her once her good name is gone." The truth of it settled heavily over the small study, and even Corwin's fierce resolve seemed to falter slightly under the weight of it. Lady Osgood, watching the exchange with careful, searching eyes, finally spoke again, her tone gentler than before. "Then we must ensure her good name is never truly threatened at all," she said. "Corwin, go and speak with Mrs. Pemberley directly, quietly, before Delphine has the chance to plant her poison there first. Miss Thornberry, come with me. I think it is past time you and I had a proper conversation about exactly what Delphine believes she knows, and how we might best answer it before this evening's supper turns into something none of us can control." Hazel followed Lady Osgood from the study on unsteady legs, casting one last glance back at Corwin, who held her gaze with an intensity that seemed to promise wordlessly that whatever came next, he did not intend to let her face it alone. It was a small comfort, and not nearly enough to still the fear churning through her, but as she followed Lady Osgood down the corridor toward whatever confrontation awaited them, she found herself grateful, for the first time in 2 years, that she was no longer facing danger entirely by herself. Lady Osgood led Hazel not toward the drawing room, but to a small sitting room adjoining it, where the low murmur of gathered guests could be heard clearly through the connecting doors. She positioned herself near the gap, listening carefully for a moment before turning back to Hazel with a grim expression. "She is telling them she saw a letter," Lady Osgood said quietly, "addressed to you, in a hand she does not recognize, delivered in secret and read alone in your room. She claims a housemaid confirmed as much to her lady's maid, and she is suggesting the letter came from Corwin himself, some manner of improper correspondence unbecoming of a duke's regard for a lady's companion." Hazel felt a wave of relief so sudden it nearly buckled her knees, followed almost immediately by fresh alarm. The letter was real, but it had nothing at all to do with impropriety. It concerned my father's affairs, nothing more. But if I explain that now, I must also explain everything it contained, and I do not know that I am prepared to make Holloway's scheme public before your brother has decided how best to proceed. Then we tell them only what is necessary, and nothing more. Lady Osgood's mind seemed to be working quickly, turning the problem over with the same sharp practicality Hazel had noticed in her from their very first conversation in the East Gardens. The letter concerned a private family matter, unrelated to any impropriety whatsoever. That much is entirely true, and it need not touch on Holloway at all, not yet. As for the rest, the suspicion that has apparently grown around you and my brother these past days, I think perhaps the wisest course is not to deny it too forcefully, but to address it plainly enough that Delphine's insinuations lose their power to wound. I do not understand. Delphine's entire strategy depends on scandal, on the suggestion of something hidden and shameful, Lady Osgood explained. If you and Corwin walk into that room and behave as though there is nothing at all to hide, if he acknowledges honestly that you are old acquaintances he holds in high regard, without shame or evasion, there is very little scandal left for her to work with. It is only secrecy that gives her claims their teeth. Before Hazel could fully consider the wisdom of this approach, the connecting door opened and Corwin entered, his expression set with the same controlled determination she had seen in the study. Behind him, unexpectedly, stood Mrs. Pemberley, looking flustered but resolute. "I have spoken with Mrs. Pemberley," Corwin said. "She understands the full situation now, or as much of it as we can safely share, and she does not intend to abandon you to Miss Ashcomb's schemes, Hazel." "Certainly not," Mrs. Pemberley said, drawing herself up with more dignity than Hazel had ever seen her display. "I have known you 2 years, my dear, and whatever foolish gossip that woman means to spread, I know you far too well to credit a word of it. I only wish you had told me sooner about your father's troubles. I might have been of some help, had I known the truth of it." Hazel felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, moved by a loyalty she had not fully expected from her employer. "I did not wish to burden you, ma'am." "Nonsense. That is precisely what friends are for." Mrs. Pemberley patted her arm firmly. "Now, I think Lady Osgood's plan has considerable merit. We shall simply go in there together, all of us, and face this nonsense head-on, rather than skulking about as though there were anything to be ashamed of." Hazel looked to Corwin, searching his face for any hesitation, any flicker of reluctance at the prospect of publicly acknowledging their acquaintance before a room full of guests eager for scandal. She found none. His gaze held hers steadily, full of a quiet resolve that steadied something in her own chest despite the fear still coursing through her. "Are you certain, Your Grace?" she asked quietly. "This will not reflect well on you, whatever we say." "I have spent 3 years being far too careful about what reflects well on me, Hazel," he said. "I find I have grown thoroughly tired of it." They entered the drawing room together, the small party arranged with deliberate care, Mrs. Pemberley at Hazel's side, Lady Osgood a step behind, Corwin walking with the unhurried confidence of a man entirely unafraid of whatever conversation awaited him. The room fell into an immediate, uneasy silence at their entrance, dozens of eyes turning toward them with poorly concealed curiosity. Delphine stood near the fireplace, mid-sentence, her expression flickering with surprise before settling into something more carefully composed. "Your Grace," she said smoothly, "we were just discussing the most curious rumor. I do hope you might help clarify matters. I understand there has been some speculation regarding my acquaintance with Miss Thornberry," Corwin said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet room, calm and unhurried in a way that immediately robbed the moment of the dramatic scandal Delphine had clearly hoped to provoke. "I see no reason for speculation, when the truth is easily told. Miss Thornberry and I first met several years ago, in Somerset, and I have held her in high regard ever since. I was glad, upon discovering her present situation, to renew that acquaintance, and I make no secret of the fact that my regard for her has only deepened in the time since. There is nothing improper in an old friendship, however it may have been characterized to this room in my absence. A ripple of murmured surprise moved through the assembled guests, though it carried more curiosity than censure, precisely as Lady Osgood had predicted. Delphine's composed expression flickered, just slightly, clearly unprepared for such open, unashamed acknowledgement. "How very candid of you, Your Grace," she managed, though I confess I understood the matter to involve rather more secrecy than mere friendship would suggest. A letter, delivered in the dead of night, read alone and never mentioned to anyone in this household. "The letter concerned a private family matter of my own," Hazel said, finding her voice at last, steadier than she had expected. "It had nothing whatsoever to do with His Grace, beyond the unfortunate coincidence that it touched upon events from several years past, before either of us knew of it. I did not share its contents because they concerned my own family's affairs, not because there was anything shameful in it requiring concealment." Delphine's gaze sharpened, calculating rapidly, and Hazel could see the exact moment her opponent decided that a direct approach, however costly, was preferable to a retreat that would leave her looking foolish before the very society she had hoped to impress. "Family affairs," Delphine repeated, her voice carrying deliberately now, loud enough for the entire room to hear clearly. "How curious, that Miss Thornberry's family affairs should so closely concern a duke's household. Perhaps you might explain to this room, Miss Thornberry, precisely what disgrace drove your own father from society 2 years ago, and why a woman with such a history should find herself the object of such particular attention from a man of His Grace's standing." The room's murmur sharpened into something closer to shock, and Hazel felt the old, familiar fear rise up sharply in her chest, the same fear that had driven her into gray dresses and careful silence for 2 long years. But before she could answer, before the panic could fully take hold, Corwin stepped forward, his expression hardening into something Hazel had not yet seen from him, cold and unyielding. "Since you press the matter so publicly, Miss Ashcombe, I will answer it just as publicly." His voice carried clear authority through the silent room. "Miss Thornberry's father was ruined 2 years ago through the deliberate scheme of a man once employed by my own family, a man who falsified accounts and diverted funds to cover his own losses, then arranged matters so that suspicion fell entirely upon an innocent gentleman rather than himself. This was discovered only this week, through inquiries my own steward conducted at my direct request. Miss Thornberry's father was entirely blameless, the victim of a fraud committed under my family's name, and I intend to see his reputation fully and publicly restored, along with proper compensation for the losses he suffered." The silence that followed this declaration was profound. Hazel could feel every eye in the room shifting between herself and Corwin, the story rearranging itself entirely from the scandal Delphine had hoped to construct into something far more sympathetic, and considerably more damaging to Delphine's own credibility for having pressed the matter so aggressively. "I did not know," Delphine said finally, some of her earlier confidence visibly draining away. "No," Corwin said, "you did not trouble yourself to know, before attempting to use a woman's private grief as a weapon against her reputation, in front of an entire room of witnesses. I would ask you to consider, Miss Ashcombe, whether that reflects rather more poorly on your own character than anything you hope to expose in Miss Thornberry's." Delphine had no ready answer for this, and after a long, uncomfortable moment, she excused herself from the room with as much dignity as she could manage, her earlier triumph transformed entirely into humiliation. The remaining guests began to murmur among themselves, sympathy now clearly turning toward Hazel rather than suspicion, and Mrs. Pemberley squeezed her arm warmly, beaming with unmistakable pride. But Hazel, standing at the center of a room full of newly sympathetic strangers, felt none of the relief she might have expected. The public exposure of her father's story, however sympathetically received, meant that her carefully guarded privacy was now gone entirely, replaced by public knowledge that would follow her wherever she went from this day forward. And Corwin's declaration, however honestly meant, had made his own feelings a matter of public record in a way that could not now be undone, tying his name and his family's reputation to hers in front of the very society whose good opinion he depended upon. Lady Osgood found her a few minutes later in the hallway outside the drawing room, catching her arm gently before she could retreat further. "That was very bravely done, Miss Thornberry. I know it cannot have been easy, having your family's story laid bare before so many strangers." "I did not have much choice in the matter," Hazel said, still shaking slightly from the encounter. "Miss Ashcombe left me none." "No, she did not, though I think she will regret pressing the matter so publicly, once she has had time to consider how thoroughly it has turned against her." Lady Osgood studied her for a moment, something gentler than her usual teasing manner in her expression. My brother spoke very plainly in there, Miss Thornberry. I do not think he meant to leave any doubt at all about the nature of his feelings. I noticed, Hazel said quietly. I do not know what to do with it. You need not decide anything tonight, Lady Osgood said. Go and rest, if you can manage it. Matters will look different in the morning, I think, whatever you decide. Hazel thanked her and continued on toward the stairs, though her mind offered little comfort in the promise of morning. She passed Colton Reyes in the corridor near the servants' stair, and he paused, his expression carefully neutral though his eyes held clear sympathy. Miss Thornberry, I heard something of what happened in the drawing room. I imagine the entire household has heard of it by now, she said, managing a tired smile. For what it is worth, Colton said, I do not think there is a single person below stairs who does not admire the way you bore yourself tonight, and I have served his grace long enough to know that what he said in that room was not spoken lightly. He is not a man given to grand declarations, Miss Thornberry. When he makes one, it is because he means it entirely. Hazel found she could not answer that without her composure finally breaking, so she only nodded and continued on her way, grateful for his kindness, even as it added one more weight to the tangle of feelings pressing in on her from every direction. She had wanted, for 2 years, nothing more than to be left alone, unnoticed and unremarkable. Now, in the space of a single evening, she had become the center of exactly the kind of attention she had worked so hard to avoid, and though her father's name would finally be cleared, she could not shake the feeling that she had lost something else entirely in the process, some fragile sense of safety she did not know how to reclaim. Long after the household had settled into quiet for the night, Hazel sat by her window, watching moonlight fall across the gardens below, and made a decision that felt, in the moment, like the only path left open to her. She could not remain at Ashford Hall, not now, not with her story known to every guest in the house, and her connection to the Duke laid bare before all of society. She would leave before dawn, before anyone could stop her, and find somewhere else entirely to begin again, far from Corwin Vane and the dangerous, overwhelming feelings his presence had reawakened in her. She sat for a long while with her hand resting on the closed lid of the trunk, arguing with herself in the silence of her small room. Leaving felt, in some ways, like exactly the kind of retreat she had spent 2 years perfecting. The same instinct that had driven her into gray dresses and quiet corners since the very first days of her family's disgrace. But staying meant facing a household now fully aware of her history, facing Delphine's wounded pride and whatever further schemes it might produce, and facing Corwin himself, whose declaration in the drawing room had made plain a depth of feeling Hazel did not know how to answer without risking everything she had left. She thought of her father and what he would have wanted for her. She thought of Mrs. Pemberley's fierce, unexpected loyalty, and Lady Osgood's steady kindness, and Colton's quiet certainty that Corwin's words had not been spoken lightly. And she thought, finally and most persistently, of Corwin himself, standing before a room full of strangers, and choosing honesty over caution, risking his own reputation to defend hers without a moment's hesitation. It would have been easier, she told herself, to stay and face whatever came next. But easier was not the same as safer, and 2 years of hard-won caution were not so simply set aside, however much her heart argued otherwise. She packed her small trunk with quiet, careful movements, leaving behind everything that had been provided by Mrs. Pemberley's generosity, taking only what belonged truly to her. And as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the horizon, Hazel Thornberry slipped out through the servants' entrance and disappeared down the long drive of Ashford Hall, leaving no note, no explanation, nothing behind but an empty room and a decision she was not at all certain, even as she made it, that her heart would allow her to keep. The road away from Ashford Hall was quiet at that early hour, mist still clinging to the hedgerows, and Hazel walked quickly, her small trunk clutched tightly against her side, determined to reach the village and secure passage on the first available coach, before anyone at the house discovered her absence. She had perhaps a mile left to walk when she heard the sound of hooves approaching swiftly from behind, and her heart leapt into her throat even before she turned to see Corwin, still in his riding coat from what must have been a hastily saddled horse, drawing to a stop beside her on the empty road. He dismounted quickly, his expression a mixture of relief and something rawer, something that looked almost like fear. Hazel, thank God. I went to your room to speak with you before breakfast, and found it empty. Your trunk gone. I feared the worst. I did not think anyone would notice my absence so quickly, she said, though her voice wavered, betraying how little she had truly wanted to disappear without anyone caring enough to follow. Did you truly believe I would simply let you go? without a word of explanation. Corwin's voice carried an edge of hurt beneath its urgency. After everything spoken between us last night, you meant to simply vanish before dawn? What else was I to do? Hazel's composure, held together so carefully through the long, sleepless night, finally began to crack. You stood before that entire room and declared your feelings for me, Corwin. And now the whole of society knows my father's story, knows my connection to your family, and I do not know how to face any of it. I have spent 2 years learning how to survive by making myself invisible, and in one evening you have made that impossible forever. Then perhaps it is time you stop trying to be invisible, he said, closing the distance between them with careful, deliberate steps. Hazel, I did not declare my feelings last night out of some impulsive need to defend you. I said what I said because it was true, and because I am tired, entirely tired, of pretending otherwise for the sake of caution. Your caution is not the only one that matters, she said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier fierceness. I have far more to lose than you do, in risking my heart on feelings that may prove as fragile as everything else I have trusted these past 2 years. Then let me tell you plainly, so there is no more room for doubt between us. Corwin stopped directly before her, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that left no room for retreat. I have loved you, Hazel Thornberry, since the very first summer we met in Somerset, when you were nothing more than a girl in a yellow dress, laughing at some foolish joke I had made, entirely unaware that you had already undone every careful composure I had spent years building for myself. I did not stop loving you when your family's circumstances changed. I did not stop loving you when I found you 3 years later, wearing gray and pretending to be someone I would not recognize. I loved you before any of that, and I love you still, not despite the plainness you have hidden yourself behind, but because I have always been able to see past it to the woman underneath, the one who mends hems with the same fierce determination she once brought to every laugh and every conversation in that Somerset garden. I do not care what society makes of your father's story, or mine, or anything at all beyond the simple, undeniable truth that I cannot imagine my life continuing on without you in it. Hazel stood very still, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks. 2 years of careful restraint dissolving entirely under the weight of words she had never quite allowed herself to hope for. I have loved you too, she admitted, the words feeling both terrifying and enormously freeing after so long spent guarding them. Since that same summer, I told myself it did not matter, that it could come to nothing once everything changed, and I have spent every day since trying to convince myself that was the truth. It was never the truth, Corwin said softly, reaching to brush a tear from her cheek with a gentleness that undid whatever remained of her resistance. Come back with me, Hazel. Not to hide, not to disappear into gray dresses and quiet corners, but to stand beside me openly, whatever society chooses to make of it. I do not ask you to be anything other than exactly who you are. For a long moment, Hazel said nothing at all, caught between 2 years of hard-won caution and the overwhelming pull of everything she had wanted, secretly and persistently, since long before she had allowed herself to name it. Finally she nodded, unable to trust her voice, and Corwin gathered her into his arms with a relief so complete she felt it in the sudden, unguarded way his whole body relaxed against hers. They returned to Ashford Hall together, Hazel seated before him on his horse for lack of any better arrangement, and the sight of their return caused no small stir among the guests still gathered for breakfast. Mrs. Pemberley rushed forward with tears in her own eyes, embracing Hazel warmly the moment she was helped down from the horse, while Lady Osgood stood nearby with an expression of such evident satisfaction that Hazel suspected she had known, or at least strongly hoped, exactly how the morning would resolve itself. Delphine Ashcombe, for her part, made a hasty and thoroughly unremarked departure from Ashford Hall before the day was finished, her ambitions toward the Duke's title thoroughly and publicly ended by the events of the previous evening. Few among the remaining guests seemed particularly sorry to see her go, and Hazel found herself, for the first time in 2 years, entirely unconcerned with what anyone else's opinion of her situation might be. That first evening back at Ashford Hall, Hazel found herself seated at supper beside Corwin for the first time, without a single guarded thought about who might be watching, or what conclusions they might draw. The other guests, sensing the shift as clearly as if it had been announced from the rooftops, treated her with a warmth and curiosity that felt strange after 2 years of careful invisibility, though not at all unwelcome. You will have to grow accustomed to being looked at, Lady Osgood told her afterward, as the two of them sat together in the drawing room while Corwin was occupied with correspondence. I imagine it will feel uncomfortable for a while yet, after so long spent avoiding exactly that. I confess it does, Hazel admitted, though I find I mind it a good deal less than I expected. That is because you are being looked at honestly now, rather than measured and judged the way Delphine looked at you, Lady Osgood said. There is a considerable difference between the two, once you learn to feel it. Hazel thought about this for a long while after retiring that evening, turning it over the way she had turned over so many of Lady Osgood's observations since their very first conversation in the East Gardens. She realized, gradually, that it was true. She had spent 2 years afraid of being seen at all, conflating every kind of attention with the particular cruelty Delphine had shown her, when in truth there was a world of difference between being watched with suspicion and being looked at with genuine care. Colton Reyes sought her out the following morning, finding her in the same kitchen garden where they had first spoken so many weeks before, and he greeted her with the same easy, steady warmth she had come to value in him. "I understand congratulations may soon be in order," he said, a knowing smile tugging at his mouth. Hazel felt herself flush, though she did not deny it. "Nothing has been asked yet, Mr. Reyes, whatever you may have heard." "No," he agreed, "but I have known His Grace long enough to recognize the particular look he has worn since your return yesterday morning. I do not think you need concern yourself with waiting very long." He paused, his expression turning more sincere. "I am glad for you, Miss Thornberry, truly. I do not think I have seen him this unguarded in all the years I have served him." "Thank you, Colton," she said, using his given name for the first time, and finding it felt entirely natural to do so. "For your kindness to me, these past weeks. It meant more than you likely realize, at a time when I had very few people I felt I could trust. You may always trust me," he said simply, "whatever comes next for either of us." They parted with an easy warmth that Hazel treasured, grateful for the steady, uncomplicated friendship that had grown between them despite everything else swirling around her that season. The following weeks brought considerable change to Hazel's circumstances, though she navigated each new development with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Corwin's solicitor confirmed every particular of Holloway's fraud, and the matter was resolved with a public correction of record that fully restored her father's reputation, along with a settlement that provided her, for the first time in 2 years, with genuine financial security independent of anyone's charity or goodwill. She wrote to distant relations she had not spoken with since her family's ruin, informing them of the truth now come to light, and found herself, gradually, rebuilding connections she had once believed permanently severed. Corwin's courtship, once begun openly, proceeded with none of the careful restraint that had marked their earlier hidden acquaintance. He called on her regularly, walked with her through the same gardens where she had once tried so hard to remain unnoticed, and made no secret whatsoever of his intentions toward her, to the evident delight of Lady Osgood and the quiet, steady approval of Colton Reyes, who had become, over the preceding weeks, something very like a genuine friend to Hazel in his own right. Mrs. Pemberley, delighted beyond measure at the turn her companion's fortunes had taken, insisted on accompanying Hazel to the finest modiste in the county town to select a new wardrobe befitting her changed circumstances. Hazel found the experience strange at first, standing before mirrors draped in fabrics far brighter and finer than anything she had permitted herself in 2 years. But slowly, gown by gown, she felt something in herself unclench, a permission she had not realized she was still waiting for. "You look like yourself again," Mrs. Pemberley said softly, watching Hazel study her reflection in a gown of soft blue silk. "I remember thinking, the very first week you came to me, that there was a bright girl hiding somewhere underneath all that gray. I am glad I have lived to see her again." "You have been so very good to me," Hazel said, her throat tight with emotion. "I do not know how I will ever properly thank you." "By being happy, dear girl," Mrs. Pemberley said briskly, dabbing at her own eyes with a handkerchief. "That is thanks enough for any of us." Word of Holloway's fraud and its full resolution spread through the county in the weeks that followed, and rather than the whispered scandal Hazel had once feared, she found herself instead the object of considerable sympathy and respect. A woman who had borne 2 years of unjust hardship with quiet dignity, and whose family's name had now been properly restored. Old acquaintances who had distanced themselves during her family's disgrace began, cautiously at first and then with growing warmth, to renew contact, and Hazel navigated these reunions with a grace that surprised even herself, neither bitter toward those who had abandoned her, nor overly eager to forgive without genuine reflection. It was in the same East Gardens where Delphine had once delivered her cold warning that Corwin finally asked Hazel to marry him, kneeling before her among the very roses she had once walked past, with her eyes fixed carefully on the gravel path, determined to see nothing, and be seen by no one. She said yes before he had even finished the question, laughing through fresh tears at her own eagerness, and he laughed with her, pulling her close with none of the careful restraint that had governed every one of their earlier encounters. Their engagement was announced within the week, and the wedding that followed some months later was, by all accounts, one of the more talked about events of the season, not merely for the union of a duke and his bride, but for the remarkable story that had preceded it, a tale of old love rediscovered, injustice uncovered and corrected, and a woman who had finally stopped hiding herself away. Hazel wore yellow to her wedding, the first bright color she had allowed herself in 2 years, and when Corwin saw her walking toward him down the long aisle of the small country church near Ashford Hall, his expression held none of the careful restraint she had once relied upon to keep her own feelings safely hidden. He looked at her the way he had looked at her that very first summer in Somerset, before ruin or disguise or careful gray dresses had ever come between them, as though he could see, clearly and completely, exactly who she had always been, underneath every layer of protection she had built around herself. She had spent 2 years wearing the plainest dress she owned, determined to go unnoticed, never once imagining that the man who had loved her for years would see straight through every careful disguise she constructed, straight to the woman who had never truly disappeared at all. A year had passed since the wedding, when Hazel found herself once more in the East Gardens at Ashford Hall, though now the house belonged to her as much as it belonged to Corwin, and the roses she had once walked past with such careful, downcast eyes bloomed richly under her own direction, for she had taken a particular interest in the gardens since becoming mistress of the estate. She was not alone that afternoon. A young girl of perhaps 10 years, the daughter of a neighboring family visiting for the week, walked beside her, peppering her with the kind of unguarded questions only children seemed brave enough to ask. "Your Grace," the girl said, using the title with careful formality, though her tone remained entirely familiar. "Why do you still wear that gray dress sometimes? Lady Osgood says you have the finest wardrobe in the county now, and yet I have seen you in that same plain gown at least 3 times since I arrived." Hazel smiled, glancing down at the familiar gray fabric, softened now with wear but otherwise unchanged from the dresses she had once worn so deliberately to avoid notice. "It is a very old dress," she said. "I wore it during a difficult time in my life, when I needed very much to go unnoticed by the world. But you are a duchess now. Surely no one would dare overlook you." "No," Hazel agreed, laughing softly at the girl's blunt observation. "They would not. But I do not keep the dress to hide anymore. I keep it because it reminds me of something important." "What is that?" Hazel considered the question seriously, as she always tried to answer children's questions, understanding instinctively that their curiosity deserved honest reflection rather than easy dismissal. "It reminds me that even when I tried very hard to make myself invisible, there was someone who saw me anyway. Someone who looked past the plain dress and the quiet manners and saw exactly who I was underneath, long before I believed anyone ever could again. I keep the dress to remember that being truly seen, by the right person, is one of the greatest gifts life can offer, and that no disguise, however carefully constructed, can hide us entirely from those who truly care to look." The girl considered this with the particular seriousness children sometimes bring to matters they do not yet fully understand, then nodded as though satisfied, and skipped ahead toward the fountain where Lady Osgood's own children had gathered to play. Hazel watched her go, smiling at the easy, uncomplicated joy of childhood, before turning at the sound of familiar footsteps on the gravel path behind her. "Explaining your wardrobe choices to young Miss Effington, I take it," Corwin said, coming to stand beside her, his arms settling naturally around her waist in the easy, unguarded way that had become entirely second nature to them both over the past year. "She is very direct in her questioning," Hazel said, leaning into him comfortably. "I confess I rather admire it." "You would," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You spent 2 years being the very opposite of direct, hiding behind gray dresses and careful silences. I imagine there is something satisfying in watching a child ask exactly the questions she wishes answered, without a moment's hesitation." "There is," Hazel agreed, "though I do not regret the caution, even now. It kept me safe, in its way, during a time when I had very little else to protect me." "No," Corwin said quietly, "I do not think you should regret it either. But I am glad, every single day, that it did not keep you hidden from me forever." They walked together through the gardens in comfortable silence for a while, Hazel's hand resting easily in his, the two of them pausing occasionally to greet guests scattered throughout the grounds for the small gathering Lady Osgood had arranged to celebrate the first anniversary of their wedding. Mrs. Pemberley, who had become something very like a beloved aunt to Hazel over the intervening months, waved cheerfully from a bench near the roses, deep in conversation with Colton Reyes, who had recently become engaged himself to a young woman from the village, a match that delighted the entire household in equal measure. "Do you ever think of that first night?" Hazel asked. "When you found me in the linen room, mending Mrs. Pemberley's gown by candlelight?" "Often," Corwin admitted. "I have thought of it a great many times since, wondering what might have happened if I had simply walked past that door without opening it. If I had never seen you again at all, never learned what had become of you, never had the chance to correct the wrong done to your family, or to tell you everything I had been carrying for 3 long years before that night." "I think of it too," Hazel said softly. "I was so certain, in that moment, that being seen again would only bring danger. I had built my entire life around the belief that safety meant invisibility, that the plainest dress and the quietest manner were the only protection I had left. I did not understand, not truly, until much later, that there is a difference between hiding from danger and hiding from the very possibility of being loved. And now? Now I understand it perfectly," Hazel said, turning to face him fully, the late afternoon sun catching gold in her hair, no longer pinned back so tightly, no longer dressed to disappear. "I understand that the plainest dress in the world could not have hidden me from you, because you were never looking at my dress at all. You were looking at me, the whole time, long before I believed there was anything in me worth seeing." Corwin gathered her close, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, content simply to stand together in the gardens that had once witnessed so much fear and uncertainty, now transformed entirely into a place of quiet, settled happiness. Around them, the sound of children's laughter drifted from the fountain, mingled with the low murmur of gathered friends and family, and the roses bloomed in every direction, no longer a backdrop for careful avoidance, but simply, finally, a garden Hazel could walk through without a single thought of remaining unseen. That evening, as the gathering wound down and guests began to make their way back toward the house for supper, Hazel found herself alone for a moment on the terrace, watching the sun set in brilliant shades of gold and rose over the grounds of the estate she now called home. She thought of the frightened young woman who had once walked these same paths with her eyes fixed carefully on the gravel, terrified of being recognized, certain that safety could only be found in disappearing entirely. She thought of everything that had changed since that first startled encounter in the linen room. Her father's name restored, a fraud exposed, a cruel scheme unmasked, and a love that had waited patiently through years of separation and disguise to finally be spoken aloud. She heard Corwin's footsteps approaching before she turned to see him, and she smiled, no longer needing to guard her expression or measure her reaction, simply allowing herself the full, unguarded joy of his presence beside her. "Ready for supper, Your Grace?" he asked, offering his arm with the same easy warmth that had become so familiar over the past year. "Always," she said, slipping her hand through his arm and allowing him to lead her back toward the house, toward the warm light spilling from every window, toward a life she had once believed impossible for a woman who had spent so long convinced that the only safety lay in being overlooked entirely. At supper that evening, seated at the long table surrounded by the people who had become, in the span of a single remarkable year, her truest family, Hazel found herself reflecting on how much had changed since she had last sat at this very table, dressed in gray, keeping her eyes carefully lowered, terrified of drawing even a moment's attention. Lady Osgood raised a glass partway through the meal, calling for a toast, and the table quieted as she rose to speak. "A year ago," Lady Osgood began, her eyes finding Hazel's with unmistakable warmth, "I watched my brother ride out at dawn after a woman who believed the only way to protect herself was to disappear entirely. I confess I did not know in that moment whether he would return with her at all, or whether two people who so clearly loved one another would let fear win out over everything else. I am endlessly grateful that fear did not win." To Hazel and Corwin, who taught this entire household something valuable about the difference between hiding and healing, and who remind us all that the people worth loving are the ones who see us clearly, plain dress or no. The table raised their glasses with warm applause, and Hazel felt tears prick at her eyes, for what felt like the 100th time that year, though these tears, unlike so many she had shed during her 2 years of quiet hardship, carried nothing but gratitude. Mrs. Pemberley dabbed at her own eyes across the table, while Colton Reyes offered Hazel a quiet, knowing smile that spoke of everything they had weathered together during those difficult weeks. Later, as the evening drew to its close and guests began retiring for the night, Corwin drew Hazel aside near the great staircase, his expression turning more serious than it had been throughout the celebratory day. "I received a letter this morning," he said quietly, "from Miss Ashcombe. She writes to inform us that she has recently become engaged to a gentleman of considerable fortune in the north, and offers her congratulations on our anniversary, along with what I believe is intended as a genuine apology for her conduct last year." Hazel considered this news for a moment, surprised to find she felt no lingering bitterness at all, only a distant, settled peace. I am glad for her, truly. I hope she finds in her own marriage something more honest than the ambition that drove her here. You are a better woman than I am, to wish her well so easily, Corwin said, though his tone carried clear admiration. I am not being generous for her sake, Hazel said, smiling. I am being generous because I have everything I could possibly want, and I find I have no room left in my heart for old grievances. She reached up to touch his face gently, marveling still, even after a full year of marriage, at how completely her life had transformed since that frightened night in the linen room. Take me up to bed, Your Grace. I find I have had quite enough excitement for one anniversary. He laughed, low and warm, and led her up the staircase toward the rooms that had become, over the past year, truly and completely her home. Behind them, the great house settled into quiet for the night, its halls no longer holding any secrets Hazel needed to fear, its gardens blooming freely under her own careful direction, and its future stretching ahead of her, bright and unguarded, in every color she had once denied herself. She had worn the plainest dress in the world to go unnoticed, certain that disappearing was the only way to survive. She had never imagined that a man's quiet, patient love could see straight through every careful disguise, waiting years for the chance to finally be spoken aloud, nor that being truly seen, at last, would prove to be not a danger at all, but the greatest gift her difficult, uncertain life had ever offered her.